Good to go.
Brilliant, thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Judith, and I'm your Derwent ambassador for the evening. And we're going to be creating our own springtime wreath with Inktense pencils. I've been so fed up of the weather here in the UK. I don't know what the weather's like with you, but it's been cold and wet, and we're starting to see the spring flowers come up. So I thought it was the perfect time to introduce some lovely colour into the world, because I'm just so fed up of the rain. I don't know what it's like by you, but it's been cold. It's really cold here. I mean, my studio is freezing. So in front of you is, in front of me even, is what we're going to be creating this evening. It's a lovely spring wreath, but we've got some hand lettering going on as well. Now in the files, you have an outline. When I'm drawing an outline, I draw my outlines not in a soft pencil. I like to draw my outlines in a fairly firm pencil. When I say firm, I use, out of the Derwent ranges, either an F or an H. Now an F normally stands for firm, or an H normally stands for hard. And the reason why I use those is because you don't get lots of graphite on your paper. And when you get lots of graphite on your paper, it can make it dirty and muddy. So I tend to, when I'm drawing, as a little hint and tip for you, is I try to avoid any pencils that have a B. So you'll see on your pencil here, you've got a little letter. So try and keep the ones with either an H or an F for your drawing when you're using any form of water-based pencil, because it keeps your drawing nice and clean and tidy. The other thing you've got in your files is a hand lettering sheet. I created this for you because you don't have to use the word spring if you don't want to. You could personalize this and give it to your friend or a family member. You could create it for yourself and put it on the wall. So what you've got is you've got a capital letter followed by a lowercase on each letter of the alphabet. Never join up your capital letters, only ever join up your lowercase letters. So you'll see here, the S is standalone, but then the rest of the letter is all joined up. The rest of the word is all joined up. So here, for example, I'm Judith. I would do J on its own, and then the rest of my name would be joined up. So what you could do is you could do this evening if you've already drawn it out. You could recreate another one and personalize it for a friend, a family member, yourself. You could even do it on fabric. So what we're going to do first is I'm going to be using Inktense pencils. You can use watercolor pencils if you've got watercolor pencils. That's absolutely fine. The technique will be a little bit different, and I'm happy to keep talking through with you with that. I keep my pencils sharp at all times. They work best sharp. They are still a wax-based pencil. So even though they are an ink-like pencil, they're still wax-based. So they work best sharp. The thing with Inktense pencils is you don't need to use very much at all, because being an ink-like pencil, they are pigment, not dye. So they're really, really bright and vibrant. Now, what I want you to bear in mind when we start is these are permanent once they're dry. So if you've got sleeves, I'm wearing a dark cardigan, but if you're wearing something light, just roll it up or fold it back if you're using Inktense, because they are permanent once dry. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to get it on your cuffs or your sleeves, because I've done that and I've ruined clothes before now because it doesn't come out. Because you can use Inktense on fabric. You can use it on any porous surface. And once it's dry, it's permanent. So just take care of the clothes that you're wearing and just push your sleeves back if you're using Inktense. If you're right-handed, we're going to start on the left of the lettering. If you're left-handed, we start on the right. And that's because you don't want to smudge your work. This nice colour is a pencil in the set of 12 called teal green. That's the other thing I like about Derwent's pencils, is they have this lovely colour dip that's synonymous with Derwent. And then all the pencils are really clearly labelled as well. So this is called teal green. It does have a number, but I never use the numbers because I always go by the colour dip on the end. Again, keep it nice and sharp. Always use a pencil sharp. Start, because I'm right-handed, I'm going to start on the left. You don't need to press very hard. So we're going to just draw around the lettering.
Judith, one of the questions we're seeing is what type of paper are you drawing on, and what else could we use these on?
Absolutely. So the paper I'm drawing on is actually Derwent's light fast paper. It's not the Inktense paper, it's the light fast paper. And what this is, it's a hot press watercolor paper. I chose a hot press watercolor paper because pencils like smoother paper. They don't like textured paper. So you could use any hot press watercolor paper, but I like it at about £140. You wouldn't want to go below £120. If you go below £120, you're going to have to start stretching paper when you add water, or it's going to start going wrinkly. And if you wanted to gift this as a present to somebody, you don't want wrinkly paper. You could use a heavyweight cartridge paper or a mixed media paper, but you still want to stay above £120, or it's about 280 GSM. The other thing to look for when you're looking at a paper is avoid shiny paper or avoid really white paper. When you have shiny paper, it means it's been coated. Your pencils never stick very well to that paper. They always sit on top, and you will never get the vibrancy that you want in your artwork. You'll always be ever so slightly disappointed. And it's because it has this coating on it. And unfortunately, it's always in the lower quality papers that I see it. And my students can get really disappointed in their work. And when you hold the paper up to the light, it has this funny sheen to it. So always make sure your paper is matte and it's not shiny. The other thing I suggest you look for is avoid really white paper. Really white paper has what we call optical brightening agents. And I know that sounds really technical, but basically it's bleach. And why is that important? You probably think it's lovely to have a white paper, but bleach will affect your artwork. And if you've spent a lot of time creating a beautiful piece of work, the last thing you want is for it to fade. And it can fade really rapidly when you have bleach in the paper. And it doesn't matter what quality pencils you use, your paper is just as important. I'm going to quickly show you something. So if you have photocopy paper, so photocopy paper here is just a lower quality paper. So you can see the colour difference. This is the whitened bleach paper because you just use it for photocopying, and this is art grade paper. and you can see the difference in the colour. And that's because there's no bleaching agents in it. So when you're using Inktense pencils, you don't need to press very hard at all. You're basically brushing the surface. There's so much pigment in here, you hardly need to push. You'll also see what I do is I have a little habit, and it's a really good habit to get into. I rotate my pencil a quarter of a turn regularly. And what that does is it makes sure I keep my pencil sharp at all times. It stops me developing a chisel point. And it means I don't have to sharpen my pencil all the time. So my pencils are going to last longer. I don't have to keep sharpening them. You get more time out of your pencils. So you don't have to push hard. So you're not even going to use the same pressure that you use to write with. It's even less than that with Inktense. Same with watercolour pencils. So if you don't have Inktense pencils this evening and you have watercolour pencils, the same applies. You don't have to press hard at all. So Inktense pencils are slightly different than watercolour pencils. Watercolour pencils are slightly opaque and their binder is clay, which makes them sometimes they can come across as a little bit cloudy and you have to move them round. And sometimes they can be a little bit patchy. And they just create a different style. They're a more traditional looking style. So they look like traditional watercolours sometimes. Inktense look a lot different. They are more translucent and you layer them. So you can layer them and layer them and layer them. And then once they're dry, they're permanent. So you can work over the top of them. The key to them being permanent is you have to wet every bit of pigment out. So as we're drawing here, every single little bit of it must get wet and then be allowed to dry. Then you can go over it again and again and again. So you could go over it with a different colour, and that's the difference. So you can't do that with watercolour because, as you'll know, the colour underneath moves. With Inktense, that doesn't happen. It's a bit like painting with acrylic, but in pencil format, and it creates an ink-like stain. So we haven't had to sharpen this pencil at all, and that's because I keep rotating it as we go along. So it's a really good habit to get into, is to just keep spinning it in your hand. You could change the colour of your lettering. You don't have to do it green, teal green. You could do rainbow lettering. You could start colour one end and transition to a different colour the other.
Judith, do you want to, we're having a lot of questions about how to start this and how to sketch out a drawing before.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk through your process a little bit?
Yeah, no problem. Okay, let me just finish this letter G. So there's different ways you can start a drawing off. One trick I was taught, and it's a really good one, is I always think tracing paper. Don't be put off by tracing paper. There is nothing wrong with using tracing paper. A is not cheating. Tracing paper is a tool. It's part of your toolkit. Okay, so you don't want to put too much graphite on your paper. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with using tracing paper, because all you're doing is transferring an image to a new piece of paper. So don't think of tracing paper as cheating. Think of it as part of your toolkit. So sometimes if I've done a sketch and I've done a drawing and I'll go over it and over it and over it, I've got way too many lines, way too many erasings, way too many fixed shapes. So what I'll do is I'll do a big sketch, and then I will get a piece of tracing paper and I will transfer my finished design to my fresh piece of paper, because tracing is a tool. But there's another way that I teach my students. What I do is it's hand-eye coordination. What you do is you need to teach the left side of your brain to talk to your right. And it's a really important one to practice. If you're right-handed, put your left finger onto where you want to draw. So if I wanted that S shape to end up here, you put your left finger onto the bit you're drawing and you start sketching. But as you're sketching, you move your leading finger round. And what this does is it teaches the left side of your brain to talk to your right. And it's something you should practice every day. And the more you practice it, the easier it gets. And what it's doing is teaching your brain to map out shapes. And it's a really important one. And it's been proven that it staves off Alzheimer's, dementia, mental health issues by years. So it's a really good thing you can get into. So think of these as shapes, but always make sure your left finger, or if you're left-handed, your right finger moves with your shapes that you're drawing. So just keep moving them around until you've got your finished design on your paper. And then put your next shape in, but keep moving this finger. If you don't move this finger, your brain can't keep up. So it's something you can practice every day, is just put your left finger onto where you want to draw and your right hand. And just keep moving shapes around. But the other thing is to use tracing paper as a tool. There's absolutely nothing wrong with using tracing paper. We're going to add some water to this hand lettering. The water brush I'm using today is the Derwent push button water brushes. I like these because they've got a bigger water reservoir and they've got a push button water brush, so I don't have to squeeze the handle at all. But it's also got a lovely fine point to it, which means that it keeps its point and it keeps a nice fine line. I don't have to squeeze it. It has a pressure sensitive bristle inside here, so it knows to release the water depending on how much I push. Inktense comes into its own when you add water. Now it's important not to do what I do at home. A lot of the time when I'm at home, I'm lying all over my work and I can be a bit of a lazy artist. You must try and keep your other hand away because it will smudge. Don't do what I normally do and be a lazy artist and lean all over your work. You can use a regular paintbrush. So if you're using a regular paintbrush, dip it in the water and then just dry your excess off on a piece of kitchen towel. But I do like the water brushes because it means I'm not going to knock over water. They're handy to have. So if maybe I'll be doing this watching television of an evening and I can just put it away. I haven't got to have water out on the table. I take them on vacation with me. I always have a water brush in my handbag. And you can do the same for if you're doing the watercolour. If you're doing the watercolour, just take your time so it doesn't go as patchy. Inktense, you can go over it and over it and over it, and it doesn't go patchy. It's far easier to use. Water brushes are really easy to clean. The ends will always stain with Inktense. They always change colour. So by the time we finish this, it will be like a Technicolor rainbow. And that's absolutely fine. It's the pigment that's staining it. They never go back to being totally white. All you need to do is wash it under the tap with a little bit of detergent or dish soap. And that's all you need to do to clean them. So just take your time. Now, if I've got a fine line with hand lettering, I always pull downwards. I never go upwards. If you go upwards, your bristles flare outwards and you don't get a nice crisp line. If you feel as though your water brush is getting a bit blocked, that's normal, and it's because you can get a buildup of wax in the bristles. All you need to do is have a bit of kitchen roll, slightly squeeze your brush, and just put a bit of extra water through the bristles. Inktense pencils are a wax-based pencil, and it's a water-soluble wax. And as you're painting, sometimes the bristles can just get a little bit stuck together with water-soluble wax. All you need to do is just push it out of the bristles by giving it a little bit of a squeeze. So I've got a fine line here and I want it to stay nice and neat. So what I'll do, start from the top and pull down. I don't go the other way. If I go the other way, the line's going to go way too thick. You can change the wording in your wreath to match the season, and you can change the flowers to match where you live. So where I live, we have a pansy. It's like a little white flower. It doesn't show up very well, so I didn't draw it tonight. And where my dad lives, they have like blue bonnets, so that would be nice. So you could certainly personalize your wreath with the flowers by you. So many different ways you could personalize it. So mine's starting to get a little bit, you can feel when your bristles are getting a bit gummed up with wax because it feels like it's dragging and you're fighting it. When it feels like that, don't try and fight it and carry on. Just give it a bit of a squeeze and straight away you'll feel the difference. All it is it's the water-soluble wax sticking the bristles together. I don't believe in fighting with art materials. If you fight with art materials, you're never going to win. And you're always going to feel disappointed. You're better off having a break, walking away, going having a cup of coffee, and coming back. Because they will always win. So there's no point having ever fighting with art materials. Just come back with a fresh face, because everything goes through an ugly stage, I call it. All my artwork, and I've been doing this for 15 years now, all my artwork goes through the most terrible ugly stage. And you have to expect that. So just take a breather for a couple of minutes and come back fighting, and you will come out the other side. Okay, so in your Inktense pencils, I'd like you to look for two different greens. So the different greens I have here is I have apple green and I have leaf green. If you've only got one green, that's absolutely fine. But if you've got two, it's even better. Now, be careful you don't lean all over your nice hand lettering that you've done. But let's have a look at these leaves over here. Now, what I want you to do is, I want you to think of the leaf starting from this point. And we're going to just draw in some stripes on one side with light green, and then some stripes on the other side with dark green. And then
one of our questions is about erasing with these pencils. Do you want to speak on that a little bit?
say this again, sorry, Molly. Is it Molly?
Erasing, can we erase with these pencils?
Right, with Inktense, it's very difficult to erase them. The reason being is they are so packed with pigment to make them so vibrant, they're very hard to get off. You have to erase them before you add water. And to get them off, so you can probably get off between 70 to 80%. However, you have to have a very good polymer eraser or vinyl eraser. Now, a good polymer or vinyl eraser is the one that's white and bendy. And they're the ones you have to have. But you will never get it all off because it's got so much pigment in it. It's designed to stain. So to get everything off is really impossible. So what I try and say is be careful. The only other thing you can do is you can use an electric eraser. Now, if you use something like the USB, there's a USB rechargeable eraser that Derwent does. That has a polymer eraser inside it. That's very successful at getting Inktense off, but really only small areas. If you're trying to get large areas off, in all honesty, I've never had much success because they are so permanent. Once you've added water, it's not coming off.
You want to show the sharper that you recommend by any chance if you have it by you?
The sharpener.
Also in addition, yeah, to the eraser.
The sharpener I love is this one. It's the Super Point. I absolutely love the Derwent Super Point. I have a Super Point and I have a Super Point Mini. And they're the ones I take with me everywhere. So I have a Super Point in my studio and I have the Super Point Mini, which is ever so slightly smaller. And I take that to art class with me everywhere. Because what that does is that gives me the point like that. And you can't get a point like that with any other pencil sharpener. Because what it does is it gives you just as much wood as it does exposed core. Some of the long point pencil sharpeners expose too much of the core, and this is what makes them weak. The Derwent Super Point exposes the same amount of core as wood, so it keeps the point stable. Some of them expose way too much of this core. I've tried so many but the super point wins every time, because here, if you look, just as much core is exposed as the wood. And this is what keeps this stable, and it stops breakages. Now, I'm a very, very heavy-handed artist. I push far too heavy on my pencils. But if I use the Super Point or the Super Point Mini, which is practically the same size, just a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter, I don't have breakages. And I can still use this long point, which keeps it nice and sharp and nice and precise, but without breaking it, because it keeps you at this stable point. Now, my latest eraser that I absolutely love is this one. This is my absolute favorite for any color pencil work, and it's the Derwent pencil eraser, because inside it is a polymer eraser, which is what I was talking about. It's a white eraser and it's bendy. So if I've got a line here, you can see it takes this line out. But then when you have rubber dustings on your paper, it has this neat little this neat little brush, which means I'm not putting my hand or the grease off my skin onto the paper, which makes a big difference. And this has become my go-to because it's a polymer eraser inside. This is my favorite. It's just the most fantastic little tool ever. I wish I had it years ago. So with your leaf, just go over it, but still blend it in the direction of your pencil strokes. So you're blending the light half in that direction, and then the darker half in the other direction. And then whilst it's still wet, just go over it again. And what that does is it just increases the vibrancy and the depth of colour. As long as your paper is wet and you're drawing over with Inktense, it will be permanent. And then you can do the same on the other leaves, but perhaps you could draw the other way. So you could go with your lines downwards this time. Your lines don't always have to go in the same direction. So maybe they could go that way. And then blend. So again, you can draw over draw. So don't forget, you can use Inktense pencils on fabric. So I might use these on tote bags, tea towels, t-shirts. Just let them dry overnight. I always leave my fabric work to dry overnight. And then I wash it on a 30-degree wash. I never wash it hotter than that. You always get a little bit of fading, but not much. You can use it on baseball caps, on basketball shoes, on wood, on slate. As long as it's a porous surface, you can use Inktense on anything. So at Easter time, I sometimes do table settings, which are quite nice to match my spring wreath. And you can make little wooden Easter tree decorations to match your colours. So you can build up your picture quite quick. It's like a jigsaw. you can see how vibrant they go when you add water. I always think Inktense look go magic when you add water. I always think that's when the magic happens. And I have one in my set called Bark. Now, I'm only going to very quickly sketch the branch in, and it really is a light sketch. Because Inktense has so much pigment in, you don't want to be colouring this in. It would be too dark. Take too long. And to be perfectly honest, you'd get fed up. Because when you're painting or colouring something like a spring wreath, the last thing you want to be doing is spending hours colouring in a dark bark. So the best thing you can do is sketch it in quite loose and lightly, because you don't want it to overpower your picture. You want the main show stopper to be your bright colours. So you're looking at forming shapes, a framework. It's a framework to hold your flowers, to hold your leaves, and a placeholder for your lettering. Think of it that way. It's a framework. So you can sketch quite loosely. Now, the other thing you can do is, don't forget, you can turn your paper. Just because it's a wreath does not mean you can't turn your paper. So if you're right-handed, turn it round. Because then you're not putting your hand, you're not twisting it. It's important not to twist your arm when you're drawing. You'll end up hurting yourself. And you don't want to do that because it takes away the enjoyment. It's only shapes. Don't think of it that you can or you can't draw something. Don't think that you can't draw a spring wreath. Don't think that you can't do lettering. It's only shapes. So do feel free to turn it upside down. Sometimes what I do is I turn my reference upside down as well, which makes me really look at the shapes because I can no longer think of them as an object. So I really have to look at the shapes and the spaces. So it's quite a good exercise to get into, is to turn your work upside down. Just remember to turn it back again when you want to add water. Okay, make sure your brush is clean. When you're cleaning your water brush, all you need to do is pull it across a piece of kitchen towel. That's all it is. And then just paint over by adding water. And we're just going to turn the Inktense pencil into its ink format just by adding water. And you can see I hardly put any pencil on that paper. We didn't colour it in heavy. If you add too much pencil on the paper, that's when I get people saying to me, my Inktense pencil isn't permanent. My Inktense pencil is moving. And that's because you're putting too much pencil on the paper. You don't need to. You can see how dark it's gone with how very little pencil. You're better off building it up in layers than putting too much pencil down to start with. Inktense works best in layers. That's when it comes into its own. You can layer it and layer it and layer it. So there's no point going very, very heavy to begin with. I learned that quite early on after various mistakes that I'd made very early on in my crafting. Is there's no point going in very heavy because there's too much wax. It's too much soluble wax and it just gets messy. So you're better off putting hardly any pencil on the paper, diluting it, and then if you want to go darker, add another layer. And that way your pencil's permanent and it doesn't shift underneath. Okay, so I'm bending round and you'll see I'm trying to bend my arm round. It's at this point, that's when you turn your work. It's much easier to get a nice, straight, sharp line if you remember to turn your work. Okay, so my bristles are gumming up a bit. I could feel them starting to lose their fluidity. Just clean your brush off. Give it a little bit of a squeeze. You can see that was so much easier to blend then, just by cleaning my brush off. Just some little tools of the trade, some little tips can just make your experience a little easier.
Judith, when we are layering colors, do you normally wait for it to dry to add another layer, or how do you do that?
I do, because Inktense is translucent. So if you layer colours and it's not totally dry, what can happen is it can lift off a bit because it's got this wax in it. So it can be a little slippy. So what I do is I let it dry and then I use the translucency and add the colour on top. I find is the best way because it's got this water soluble wax. If you go in too early, you lift the colour off the paper instead of going on top. I find that's the best way with Inktense pencils. With Inktense paint, it's a little bit different and you can just layer it and layer it and layer it. But with the Inktense pencils, there's so much wax in them that I do find it's best to let them dry and then layer it to mix new colours. Or I will show you on a flower how you can mix colours without having to let it dry. That's what we'll do next. Whilst you've got your bark pencil out, just draw in the fine lines on these little branches. And we'll add some berries in, otherwise we'll forget the berries. So just take a red and just add some berries. Now you don't always have to use Inktense wet. No, it won't be permanent, but no, we're not going to be rinsing this artwork under a tap. So you can always use Inktense dry. Inktense is still a beautiful pencil dry. It's vibrant, it's bold, it layers, and a lot of artists use Inktense dry. It's still a beautiful pencil. So you can do these berries here with a nice dry Inktense pencil, and they still remain vibrant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how you can create a new colour by blending two together. I think that's a really good idea. So what we'll do is I'm going to take a yellow and an orange, and also we'll add in a red in a bit as well. So we'll have our red up there waiting for us. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a yellow and an orange, and we'll do this flower in the background. We're going to give ourselves a highlight. So the light is going to come from the top. So what we can do is we can shade just the top of the petals. Now we don't want just jumping in from yellow to bright orange. We want a nice transition. So we're going to put the yellow down first on the top of each petal. And let me zoom in for you in a minute so you can see, because yellow can be a little tricky to see on camera. Okay, so let me do this and then let me zoom in for you. Okay, so let's do this. Let's focus in on this flower here whilst we do it. So at the top of every petal, we've put some yellow. Now, if we were to just put the orange down, it would be too much of a jump. So what we're going to do, go make it there, is we're going to mix a new colour. So bring your yellow down a little bit further. Now I'm using what I call an elliptical pencil stroke. It's like round loops. Doesn't matter if you don't do that, but it's just easier to get a nice smooth blend. And what you're doing is you're pushing the pigment into the paper. And then over the top of that, we're going to take our orange and very lightly just blend a little bit of orange, and it really is lightly. You're going to blend some orange. So we're going to create a new colour, because we don't have a pale orange in this set of 12. So we need to make one. And then just to smooth it out, I always suggest going back in with the original colour. So we go yellow, orange, yellow. And then we can go in with the orange. And you can see the difference between the orange. So we've created a mid-orange, a lighter orange with our dark orange here. And you really can see the difference. And you can smooth it out a little with your yellow if you want. But don't forget, we're going to add water. So even if you only have a set of 12 pencils, that's okay, because you can create so many colours from just that small set. It's astounding. So then you can get your yellow and you can do what it's called, I've got a favourite word, it's called smushing. It's one of my favourite words. You can kind of smush it all together with your yellow.
Judith, we have about 10 minutes left.
Perfect, thank you. So what you can do is take your water brush, just make sure it's clean. Okay, so we make sure it's clean by taking it on a piece of paper. Start with your pale colour. You must go light to dark. So start with your pale colour, then pull into your mid colour that we created, and then into your darker colour. And then what you can do is, if it's gone patchy, clean your brush off, and then just smooth it out. So much easier to use than watercolour. You can't do this with watercolour. With watercolour, you get hard lines, you get what we call cauliflowers, You just can't do this. It goes patchy, it lifts off. You get in a right mess with it. Inktense is far more forgiving. You can layer it and layer it and layer it. You can blend it. You can move it around. You can make new colors. It's far easier to use. So again, start from the light area. Go to your mid, into your dark, then clean your brush off and just smooth it out. You can do the center of your flower really easily. So the center of the flower, I like to use 2 colors, and it may seem really silly, but I like to use a dark indigo, so it's a deep indigo, and then a black. And this is what Grace asked about mixing colors. So what you can do is you put your blue down first. This might seem really weird that you're putting blue down. Blue before black makes a much nicer black. So black can be a little bit flat. If you put blue down first, it makes a much nicer black. It makes a deeper black. So put a layer of blue down. You can use a bright blue even. Any blue is better. Then put your black down on top. Again, only a light coating. You don't need to go too dark. And then add your water. And what this gives you is a much deeper black than just using a black pencil. Much deeper. And then with your black pencil, just draw over whilst it's still damp. So whilst your yellow is still damp, just draw over the little stamens around the outside. So you will always get a really nice fine line when you draw in on damp. Now on this last few minutes, because what I'd like you to do is, I'd like you to carry on those flowers, but don't forget we have a couple of little buds on the top that we didn't quite finish. Just here. And in the set is one of my favorite colors. And you'll see why it's one of my favorites. It's called fuchsia. And I love getting a little bit of fuchsia into my Inktense drawing. I think it's an excuse I have, to be perfectly honest. And you'll see why. So just sketch in a shape, a flower shape. And fuchsia is the most beautiful, bright fuchsia pink. And you find it in all of the Inktense ranges. So it's in the paints, it's in the blocks, it's in the pencils, and I love the fuchsia. And if you want to make it really deep, what you can do is go back in whilst it's wet. And just deepen that a little around the outside, just to make it stand out. So what I'd like you to do is make sure you carry on with these flowers. Don't forget you have, be sure I'm in shot, you have these little fern fronds that you can do in leaf green. And again, this is one where you don't need to wet your pencil. You can just draw these little branches in. So do keep them sharp. Now, what I'd like to show you, one thing I'd really like to show you is if you're using one of these sharpeners, it's really important with any sharpener. We'll just quickly move this to the side, is when you're sharpening, pull your sharpener out, squeeze it together. Always make sure you keep your pencil steady. When you if you hold your pencil whilst you're sharpening, it's the action of holding your pencil that breaks the lead. It only needs a couple of turns, and that is surgically sharp. It's seriously sharp. If you keep holding your pencil at the end here, what happens is you get too much leverage on the core, and that's what makes your pencil core break. So even if you're using a little handheld sharpener, hold it right close to the end. If you hold it here, you're putting too much. It's like jacking a car up when you're changing the tire. You're putting too much leverage on it. Sharpening is a real art form. It's actually quite tricky to sharpen a pencil. The other thing to make sure is if you're using a handheld sharpener, the best advice I can ever give you is if your pencils keep breaking, if you're sharpening, what I'd like you to look for is look for little shavings. If you're getting little shavings, if you're getting broken leads, get rid of your sharpener. Throw those little sharpeners away. They were never meant to last forever. Little sharpeners were meant as a disposable item. But in this day and age, we've got so used to trying to make everything last forever that we keep using them. And if you think about it, that little blade is cutting through wood. They were never supposed to last. What happened is that little metal blade inside has got blunt and it's breaking your pencils. Dispose of it and replace it with a new little handheld sharpener. Doesn't have to be an expensive one even, but it's look for the little shavings. If they don't look like apple peel when you're sharpening your pencils, or if your pencils are breaking, it's your sharpener. If you then replace your sharpener and you're still getting breakages, it's the technique. There's some little handy sharpening guides on all the Derwent websites and even on the YouTube channels for sharpening. And it gives you an idea of where to hold your pencil, how to turn your sharpener. And I'm always happy to just drop any of the Derwent team a message, and I will always happy to help you with any of your technical problems or any of your technical questions regarding sharpening or anything with your pencils and your Derwent products. Do drop the Derwent team a message and I'll be more than happy to help you. They are a fantastic bunch, they really are. So as a last thing, what I would like you to do is when you've done your little leaves here, is I would like you to personalize your flowers with the colors of your choice. Maybe they're going to match your rooms. Maybe they're going to be for somebody special in your family for springtime. We've got Easter coming up here in the UK, and the children are breaking up for school again, which is, I'm told, great. I have 4 children. I don't think it's quite so great. They're going to be at home again. So I'd like you to personalize these flowers for me. And then what I would like you to do, because I know you're all super duper artists, and I love seeing what you create. I really do love seeing what you create. So if you could, when you finished your artwork, when you go on social media, if you could use a hashtag, you know, it's that little funny cross, and use Make It With Michaels. So if you go on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or YouTube and you hashtag Make It With Michaels, I'm going to look for that hashtag so I can see what you create. And there's a, also tag Derwent art _US. We'd love to see what you create with the products. And if you create any other artwork, do let the team at Michael's know. They would love to know, and do let Derwent know. We love seeing what you create with the products. Don't forget the limitations that you have with your artwork, your imagination with Inktense. You can create all sorts. Every day I see something different and something exciting that inspires me with my students, the people on social media. So do let me know what you do. I can't wait to see what you've created. And thank you so much for joining me. I hope you've got something out of it, and I'd love to see you again.